The longhouse of Jarl Thorsten stood proud against the grey autumn sky, its curved walls rising like the hull of a great ship turned upward toward the heavens. Smoke curled from the opening in the thatched roof, carrying with it the scent of roasted meat and warm mead that promised a feast worthy of the harvest season. Inside, the central hearth blazed with orange flames that danced and crackled, casting long shadows across the timber walls and illuminating the faces of those gathered within. The benches built into the walls were packed with villagers from the surrounding farmsteads, their voices rising in laughter and conversation as servants moved between them with platters of food and jugs of ale. The harvest had been generous this year, and Jarl Thorsten had spared no expense in celebrating the favor of the gods. Long trestle tables groaned under the weight of roasted pork and venison, bowls of buttered turnips and carrots, freshly baked bread still steaming from the outdoor ovens, and platters of salted fish caught from the cold northern waters. Near the high seat where Jarl Thorsten presided over the gathering, the atmosphere was thick with warmth and merriment. Warriors exchanged tales of their summer expeditions, their voices growing louder with each horn of mead they consumed. Women in their finest woolen overdresses sat together, their fingers busy with needlework, even as they gossiped about marriages and newborns. Children darted between the benches, their faces sticky with honey, and their laughter high and bright. But at the far end of the longhouse, away from the fire's warmth and the Jarl's watchful eye, sat a young woman who seemed carved from silence itself. Her name was Ingrid, and though she had lived in this village for nearly 2 winters, she remained as much a stranger as the day she had arrived. Her dress was simple, unadorned wool the color of winter bark, and her dark hair hung in a single braid down her back, woven through with none of the ribbons or beads that other women wore to such gatherings. She kept her eyes downcast, focused on the wooden trencher before her that held a modest portion of bread and vegetables. Her hands, work roughened and strong from managing her small plot of land, remained folded in her lap. She did not speak, did not laugh, did not join the conversations that swirled around her like wind through the eaves. She simply existed in the space she occupied, as unobtrusive as a shadow. This was not new. Ingrid had learned long ago that silence was her safest refuge. She had come to the village under unfortunate circumstances, a widow with no family and no protection, claiming a small farmstead that had been abandoned after its owner had perished at sea. The Jarl, in a moment of either generosity or indifference, had allowed her to stay and work the land, but permission to exist was not the same as acceptance. From the moment she had arrived, the whispers had begun. A woman alone was an oddity, something to be viewed with suspicion and judgment. Some said she had driven her husband to his doom with a sharp tongue. Others claimed she had refused to marry again out of pride, as if any man would risk taking a woman with no dowry and no connections. The cruelest rumors suggested darker things, that perhaps she had brought misfortune with her, that the gods themselves had marked her as unlucky. Ingrid had heard them all. She had felt the weight of suspicious glances when she walked through the village to trade for supplies. She had endured the deliberate way other women turned their backs when she approached, excluding her from their circles with practiced efficiency. She had grown accustomed to the way men either ignored her completely or looked at her with a calculating interest that made her skin crawl, as if her isolation made her vulnerable to advances she had no means to refuse. So she had built her life small and quiet. She tended her few sheep and chickens, worked her garden plot, spun wool through the long winter nights, and kept to herself. She attended gatherings when custom demanded it, as refusing an invitation to a Jarl's feast would be a grave insult, but she never expected warmth or welcome. She came, she sat in her designated place, and she waited for the evening to end so she could return to the solitude of her small longhouse. Tonight should have been no different. Ingrid had arrived as the sun began its descent, had taken her place at the farthest bench without fanfare, and had accepted the food that was her due as a member of the community, even if she was not truly part of it. She had planned to eat sparingly, speak to no one, and leave as soon as it would not be considered discourteous. She had no way of knowing that this feast would mark the end of her invisible existence. The first sign of trouble came when Sina approached. Signa was the wife of one of Jarl Torsten's most successful farmers, a woman whose husband's prosperity had given her an inflated sense of importance and a sharp tongue she wielded with precision. She was surrounded by her usual companions, 3 other women who served as her audience and echoed her opinions with enthusiastic agreement. They moved through the longhouse like a flock of well-fed geese, their voices carrying over the general noise of the feast. Ingrid saw them coming and felt her stomach tighten with dread. She knew that look in Sina's eyes, the particular gleam that suggested she had been drinking mead and was in the mood for entertainment at someone else's expense. Ingrid lowered her gaze further, hoping that if she made herself small enough, they might pass her by. But hope was a foolish thing to cling to in such moments. "Well, well," Sina's voice rang out, deliberately loud enough to draw the attention of those nearby. "Look who graces us with her presence, the silent widow who thinks herself too good for honest company." Ingrid said nothing. She had learned that responding only fueled such exchanges, gave them the reaction they sought. Silence was armor, or so she told herself, even as her hands tightened in her lap until her knuckles went white. "Did you hear me speaking to you?" Signa demanded, moving closer. The scent of mead was strong on her breath, and her face was flushed with drink and the warmth of the fire. "Or has your tongue been as useless as the rest of you? No wonder your husband sought death at sea. Better to face the cold waves than return to a wife who offers nothing but emptiness." The women around Sina laughed, the sound harsh and cruel. A few others nearby turned to watch, some with disapproval, but none with the courage to intervene. This was how it always went. People might feel sympathy for the target of such attacks, but few were willing to risk becoming targets themselves by offering defense. Ingrid felt heat rising in her cheeks, shame and anger mixing in equal measure. She wanted to defend herself, to point out that her husband had died in a storm that had claimed 3 other ships, that she had loved him and mourned him, that her silence was not arrogance, but self-preservation. But the words stuck in her throat, trapped by years of learning that speaking only made things worse. "Perhaps she stays silent because she knows the truth," another woman chimed in, emboldened by Sina's lead. "That she has nothing of value to say. A woman without family, without connections, without even the sense to secure another husband. What use is such a creature?" "Less use than the sheep she tends," Sina agreed, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "At least the sheep provide wool. What does she provide? She takes up land that could support a proper family, consumes resources at feasts like this, and gives nothing back to the community. She's a burden we are too generous to cast out." The words struck like physical blows. Ingrid knew, on some level, that they were designed to hurt, that Sina and her companions derived pleasure from her pain. But knowing this did not lessen the sting. She had worked hard on her small farm, had asked for nothing beyond what was rightfully hers, had never sought to burden anyone. Yet here she was, being accused of being worthless, of being less than the animals she tended. "Look at her," Sina continued, warming to her theme. "She will not even defend herself. What kind of woman sits mute while her betters speak? It is unnatural. Perhaps the rumors are true, and there is something wrong with her. Perhaps she is cursed, and that is why misfortune follows her." Murmurs rippled through the nearby crowd. The word "cursed" carried weight in a society that believed deeply in the favor and disfavor of the gods. To be marked as unlucky was to be dangerous, a potential source of contamination that could spread to others. Ingrid felt the shift in the atmosphere, saw the way some people moved subtly away from her, creating distance as if her presence might somehow taint them. Her vision blurred with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give Sina that satisfaction. She would not give any of them the pleasure of seeing her break. She kept her eyes fixed on her trencher, on the bread she could no longer imagine eating, and waited for this torture to end. Maybe we should test it, one of Sina's companions suggested, her voice taking on a cruel edge. See if touching her brings bad luck, or perhaps we should simply remove her from the feast. Why should she share in the bounty when she contributes nothing? Hands reached for Ingrid's shoulders, fingers digging into the fabric of her dress. She tensed, preparing to be hauled to her feet, to be dragged from the longhouse in humiliation. She closed her eyes, silently praying to whatever gods might still listen that this would be over quickly, that tomorrow she could return to her farm and pretend this night had never happened. But then a voice cut through the noise like an axe through wood, clear and commanding and utterly unexpected. "Touch her, and face my axe." The words fell into the longhouse like stones into still water, sending ripples of shocked silence spreading outward from their source. The hands on Ingrid's shoulders froze, then withdrew. She opened her eyes and looked up, confused and disbelieving. Standing a few paces away was a man she had never seen before. He was tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of strength earned through labor and combat. His hair was the color of pine bark, pulled back from a face that was weathered by sun and wind, but still young, perhaps 30 winters at most. He wore a simple tunic of good wool, leather breeches, and boots that had seen many miles of travel. At his belt hung an axe, well made and obviously well used, its blade catching the firelight. But it was his eyes that held Ingrid's attention. They were grey as storm clouds, and they looked at her not with pity or judgment, but with something she had not seen in so long she had almost forgotten what it looked like. Respect. He regarded her as if she were a person of worth, as if her presence mattered, as if she deserved to be defended. "Who are you to threaten us?" Sina demanded, recovering from her shock. "This is none of your concern, stranger." The man turned his gaze to Sina, and his expression hardened. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried an edge that suggested he was not a man to be trifled with. "I am Halvard, a trader, who has traveled from the eastern settlements. I arrived this evening, and was granted a place at this feast by your Jarl's generosity, and it becomes my concern when I see guests at a Jarl's feast being treated with dishonor." He emphasized the word dishonor in a way that made several people nearby shift uncomfortably. Honor was the foundation of Viking society, the measure by which people were judged and remembered. To be accused of acting dishonorably, especially in a Jarl's own hall, was a serious charge. "This woman is no guest of honor," Sina protested, though her voice had lost some of its confidence. She is a member of this community who was invited to this feast," Halvard interrupted. "Or did your Jarl not extend his invitation to all who dwell on his lands? Does he not pride himself on his generosity and his adherence to the old customs of hospitality?" The mention of the Jarl drew attention from the high seat. Jarl Thorsten, who had been engaged in conversation with his honored guests, now turned his attention to the disturbance. His weathered face showed displeasure at having his feast interrupted, but also curiosity about this stranger who spoke with such authority. "What is the meaning of this disruption?" the Jarl called out, his voice cutting through the murmurs that had begun to fill the longhouse. Halvard inclined his head respectfully. "Forgive the disturbance, Jarl Thorsten. I meant no disrespect to your feast. I merely sought to prevent a greater dishonor from occurring under your roof. These women were about to lay hands on one of your guests, to forcibly remove her from the feast for no crime other than sitting quietly and keeping her own company. Such treatment violates the sacred laws of hospitality that make feasts places of safety and community." The Jarl's eyes narrowed as he looked from Halvard to Signa to Ingrid, who remained frozen in her seat, unable to fully comprehend what was happening. "Is this true, Sina?" Sina's face had gone red, though whether from anger or embarrassment was difficult to tell. She does not belong. She contributes nothing. She tends her land, does she not?" Halvard interjected before Sina could gather her defense. She keeps her livestock, pays her dues, harms no one. Is this not contribution enough? Must every person who comes to a feast first prove their worth to those who deem themselves arbiters of belonging? His words struck at the heart of something fundamental. Viking society valued independence and self-sufficiency, the ability to maintain one's household and honor one's obligations. A woman managing a farm alone without the protection of family or husband was unusual, but she was fulfilling the basic requirements of community membership. To attack her for not being social enough, for not ingratiating herself to the established social circles, was petty and beneath the dignity of a proper feast. Jarl Torsten's expression shifted from displeasure to something more thoughtful. He looked at Ingrid with what might have been the first real attention he had paid her since granting her permission to stay in the village. "The stranger speaks with wisdom," he said finally. "All who dwell on these lands and fulfill their obligations are welcome at my feasts. If there has been mistreatment of a guest under my roof, this displeases me greatly." The weight of the Jarl's words settled over the gathering like snow. Sina and her companions paled, realizing they had crossed a line. To be called out by the Jarl himself, to be found at fault in front of the entire community, was a humiliation that would not soon be forgotten. They murmured apologies and retreated quickly, melting back into the crowd with none of their earlier boldness. The general noise of the feast gradually resumed, though Ingrid could feel many eyes still upon her, now with curiosity rather than contempt. The story of what had just transpired would spread through the community like wildfire, she knew, but for once, perhaps it would not paint her as the villain or the victim, but simply as a person who had been defended by an honorable stranger. Halvard turned back to her, and the hardness left his face, replaced by a gentle expression. "Are you well?" he asked quietly. Ingrid realized she was trembling. She nodded, not trusting her voice, afraid that if she tried to speak, the tears she had been holding back would finally fall. She had no words for what she was feeling, this strange mix of relief and gratitude and confusion. No one had defended her in so long. No one had spoken on her behalf, had seen her as worthy of protection. The simple act of intervention felt like a gift beyond measure. "May I sit?" Halvard asked, gesturing to the empty space beside her on the bench. Ingrid nodded again, still unable to speak. He sat down, careful to maintain a respectful distance, and accepted a horn of mead from a passing servant. He took a long drink, then set it down and looked at her with those steady grey eyes. "You should not have to endure such treatment," he said simply. "No one should. Feast halls are meant to be places of joy and community, not arenas for cruelty." Ingrid finally found her voice, though it came out rough and uncertain. "Why did you help me? You do not know me. I am no one to you." Halvard smiled, and it transformed his weathered face, made him seem younger and warmer. "Perhaps that is precisely why. You needed help, and I was in a position to offer it. Is that not reason enough?" She stared at him, trying to understand this man who had appeared like a figure from a saga, who spoke of honor and justice as if they were simple matters, who looked at her as if she were a person deserving of basic dignity. "I have no way to repay you." "I ask for no repayment," Halvard replied, "though if you would tell me your name, I would count that as gift enough." "Ingrid," she said softly. "My name is Ingrid." "A good name," he said. "Strong. It suits you, I think." They sat together in silence for a moment, a silence that was different from the heavy, defensive silence Ingrid had wrapped around herself earlier. This silence was companionable, almost peaceful. Around them, the feast continued, but for the first time since arriving, Ingrid felt as if she might actually be part of it, rather than simply existing on its edges. "Where are you traveling to?" she asked, surprising herself with her own curiosity. "You said you came from the eastern settlements." "I have a small trading route," Halvard explained. "I buy goods from craftsmen in one place and sell them in another, then return with different goods to complete the circuit. It allows me to see many places and meet many people. I find it suits me better than staying in one place." He paused, then added, "Though I confess, the life of a traveling trader can be lonely. It is good to sit at a fire and share a meal with others, even if some of those others forget their manners. There was humor in his voice at the last part, and Ingrid felt the corners of her mouth twitch in what might have been the beginning of a smile, a rare thing for her. "I think you may have made enemies tonight," she said. "Signa has a long memory for slights, and you humiliated her before the entire community." Halvard shrugged. "I will be gone in a few days, continuing my route. Her anger cannot reach me on the road. But you," he looked at her with concern, "you will remain here. Will there be trouble for you after I leave?" The question was perceptive, and showed a consideration for consequences that Ingrid had not expected. "There is always trouble for me," she said honestly. "Tonight may make it better or worse. I cannot say. But at least—" She hesitated, then continued, "At least for tonight, I was not alone. That is something I have not felt in a very long time." The admission cost her something, revealed a vulnerability she usually kept locked away, but Halvard did not exploit it or dismiss it. He simply nodded, as if he understood. "Aloneness is a hard burden to carry," he said quietly. "I know something of it myself." They talked then, as the feast swirled around them, about small things and inconsequential matters. Halvard told her about some of the places he had visited, described the coastal settlements where fishermen brought in catches so large it took dozens of people to haul in the nets, spoke of a craftsman he knew who made silver jewelry so delicate it looked like frozen spider webs. Ingrid, in turn, found herself speaking about her farm, about the satisfaction of shearing her sheep in spring and seeing the wool grow back thick by winter, about the way her chickens had distinct personalities, about the garden she had managed to coax into productivity despite the short growing season. It was ordinary conversation, the kind that happens between people at any gathering. But to Ingrid, it felt extraordinary. She could not remember the last time someone had asked her questions out of genuine interest rather than suspicious interrogation. She could not remember the last time her words had been received with attention rather than judgment. It was like discovering she had been holding her breath for 2 years and only now remembered how to exhale. As the night wore on and the fire burned lower, guests began to take their leave, thanking Jarl Torsten for his hospitality and making their way back to their homes through the autumn darkness. Ingrid knew she should leave as well, should return to her small longhouse before the night grew too late, but she found herself reluctant to end this strange, unexpected evening. Halvard seemed to sense her hesitation. "I am staying in the guest quarters attached to the Jarl's Hall," he said. "But I would be honored to walk you to your home, if you would permit it. The night is dark, and the paths can be treacherous." It was a courteous offer, the kind a man might make to any woman leaving a feast alone. But Ingrid understood it was also more than that. It was a continued extension of protection, a way of making clear to anyone who might be watching that she was not as alone and undefended as they might think. The gesture touched her deeply. "My farm is not far," she said, accepting, "just beyond the northern field, but I would welcome the company." They rose together and made their way to the longhouse entrance, where they collected their cloaks. The night air was cold and crisp, carrying the promise of winter not far behind. Overhead, stars glittered in a sky swept clear of clouds, and the moon cast silver light across the landscape. They walked in comfortable silence along the path that led from the Jarl's compound toward the scattered farmsteads beyond. Ingrid's home came into view, a modest longhouse much smaller than the Jarl's, its walls solid and well-maintained despite its humble size. Smoke had long since stopped rising from the roof hole, as she had banked her fire before leaving for the feast. "You keep your home well," Halvard observed. "The walls are straight, the roof is sound. You have built yourself a good life here, despite the challenges." "I have tried," Ingrid said. "It has not been easy, but I have no other choice. This is all I have. Sometimes the things we build with the most difficulty are the ones we value most highly," Halvard said. "You should be proud of what you have accomplished. Not many could manage a farm alone." They stood outside her door, and Ingrid realized she did not want this night to end, did not want to return to the solitude that had been her constant companion for so long. But she could not ask him to stay, could not impose on his kindness any further. She had already received more than she had any right to expect. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt inadequate for the weight of gratitude she carried. "For everything, for defending me, for sitting with me, for treating me as if I mattered." "You do matter," Halvard said firmly. "Never doubt that. Every person has worth regardless of what others may say or think. You are strong, Ingrid, stronger than you perhaps realize. You have survived when many would have broken. That strength is visible to those who know how to look for it." His words settled into her heart like seeds planted in fertile soil. She wondered if they might grow there, might take root and change the way she saw herself. For so long she had accepted the judgment of others, had allowed their opinions to define her worth. But Halvard saw something different, something she had almost forgotten existed within her. "Will you stay in the village long?" she asked. "A few days," he replied. "I have goods to trade, and I must rest my horse before continuing my route. But I will seek you out before I leave, if you would not mind. I would like to ensure that you are well, that tonight's events have not brought you more trouble." "I would like that," Ingrid admitted, "very much." Halvard smiled, that warm expression that transformed his face. "Then I shall make it so. Sleep well, Ingrid. May the gods grant you peaceful rest." "And you as well," she replied. She watched him walk back down the path toward the village, his figure gradually swallowed by darkness and distance. Only when he was completely out of sight did she turn and enter her home, closing the door behind her. The interior was cold, the banked fire reduced to embers, but Ingrid felt warmer than she had in months, perhaps years. As she stirred the fire back to life and prepared for sleep, she found herself replaying the events of the evening. The humiliation of Signa's attack, the shock of Halvard's intervention, the unexpected gift of conversation and companionship. It all seemed like something from a saga, too dramatic and significant to be part of her ordinary life. But it had happened. Someone had defended her. Someone had seen her as worthy of protection and respect. Someone had looked at her and seen not a burden or a ghost or a curse, but simply a person deserving of basic dignity. As she lay down on her sleeping bench, wrapped in wool blankets, Ingrid realized that something fundamental had shifted within her. For 2 years, she had made herself small, had accepted the role of invisible outsider, had believed on some level that perhaps the village was right to reject her, but tonight had challenged that belief. If Halvard, a stranger with no obligation to her, could see her worth, perhaps it existed after all. Perhaps she was not the problem. Perhaps the problem lay with those who chose cruelty over compassion, exclusion over inclusion. It was a dangerous thought, the kind that could not be unthought once acknowledged. It suggested that she might not have to accept her current existence as inevitable. It hinted at the possibility of change, of standing up for herself, of demanding the basic respect that should be afforded to any member of a community. Ingrid did not know what would come of this night. She did not know if Halvard's intervention would improve her situation or make it worse, did not know if his brief presence in her life would fade like a pleasant dream or plant seeds of real transformation. But as she drifted toward sleep, she allowed herself something she had not permitted in a very long time: hope. Perhaps tomorrow would not be exactly like yesterday. Perhaps the story of her life was not yet fully written. Perhaps there were still chapters yet to come that she could not yet imagine, possibilities she had been too afraid or too beaten down to consider. In the darkness of her small longhouse, with the fire crackling softly and the wind whispering around the eaves, Ingrid felt the first stirrings of something that might, with time and nurturing, grow into courage. And for now, on this cold autumn night, that small spark was enough. Chapter 2. The growing storm morning arrived with frost painting intricate patterns on the grass outside Ingrid's longhouse. She woke earlier than usual, drawn from sleep by thoughts that had followed her into dreams. The memory of the previous night felt both vivid and unreal, as if she had witnessed it happen to someone else. But the warmth that lingered in her chest, the lightness that seemed to have replaced some of the heaviness she constantly carried, testified to its reality. She went about her morning tasks with unusual energy. The sheep needed to be moved to fresh grazing, the chickens fed, and their eggs collected, the milk from her 2 cows processed into cheese that would help sustain her through the coming winter. These were the rhythms of her life, the work that filled her days and gave them structure and purpose. But today, even these familiar chores felt different, touched by the memory of being seen and valued. As she worked, she found herself thinking about Halvard. Who was he truly? A traveling trader, he had said, but there had been something more to him, a quality that suggested experience beyond simple commerce. The way he had spoken of honor and dignity, the authority with which he had addressed the Jarl, the presence he commanded without arrogance. These were not the traits of an ordinary merchant. But more than his identity, she wondered about his motivation. Why had he intervened? True, he had spoken of honor and the violation of hospitality customs, but many men understood these principles without feeling compelled to act on them, when doing so might create awkwardness or conflict. What had moved him to stand up for a stranger, a woman with no status or connection who could offer him nothing in return? The questions circled in her mind as she completed her morning work. By midday, she had finished the essential tasks and found herself at loose ends, a rare occurrence. Usually there was always something more to do, some project to occupy her hands and mind. But today, restlessness drove her back inside to busy herself with household tasks that could easily have waited. She was spinning wool when the knock came at her door. The sound startled her so much that she nearly dropped her spindle. Visitors were virtually unknown at her farmstead. People did not come to see her, did not seek her company. The few interactions she had with others happened in the village proper, when she went to trade goods, or when custom demanded her presence at community gatherings. Heart beating faster, she set aside her work and moved to the door. When she opened it, she found not one visitor, but 3. 2 were village women she recognized, though did not know well. Astrid and Solveig, both younger than Ingrid, married to farmers whose lands bordered her own. The third figure was a girl child of perhaps 10 winters, Astrid's daughter, if Ingrid remembered correctly. The women looked uncertain, almost embarrassed. They carried a basket between them, its contents covered with a cloth. For a long moment no one spoke, and Ingrid felt confusion mixed with wariness. What could they possibly want from her? Finally, Astrid cleared her throat. We heard what happened at the feast last night, about how Sina and her companions treated you, and about how the trader spoke in your defense. She paused, then continued in a rush. We wanted you to know that not everyone in the village shares Sina's views. Many of us have been ashamed, I suppose, at how you have been treated since you arrived. Ingrid stared at her, not quite able to process what she was hearing. Solveig stepped forward, offering the basket. We brought you fresh bread and some salted meat, not as charity, she added quickly, seeing Ingrid's expression, but as a gesture of neighborliness, of the welcome you should have received long ago. The girl peered around her mother's skirts, her eyes bright with curiosity. My mother says you tend your farm all by yourself, she said in the direct way of children, that you are very strong and brave. Is that true? Ingrid felt tears prick her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. Thank you. I do not know what to say. You need say nothing, Astrid replied. Just accept that perhaps there are those of us who would like to know you better, if you would permit it. We have been cowards, staying silent when others spoke ill of you, excluding you from our circles because it was easier than standing against the established order. But last night, when that stranger showed more courage than any of us, it made us examine our own behavior, and we found it wanting. Solveig nodded in agreement. Sina holds too much power in the women's circles. She uses her husband's prosperity like a weapon, and we have all been afraid of turning her sharp tongue on ourselves. But perhaps it is time some of that changed. You work hard, you harm no one, you fulfill your obligations. That should be enough to earn respect and basic kindness. Ingrid took the basket with shaking hands, overwhelmed by this unexpected turn of events. "I would like that. To know you better. I have been very lonely." The admission hung in the air, raw and honest. The two women exchanged glances, and Ingrid saw recognition in their eyes, perhaps even guilt. They understood, she realized, how much their collective exclusion had cost her, how the weight of isolation could crush a person slowly over time. "Then perhaps you might join us at the well tomorrow morning," Astrid suggested. "Many of us gather there to draw water and share news. You would be welcome." "I will come," Ingrid promised. "Thank you. Truly, thank you." After they left, Ingrid stood in her doorway holding the basket, watching their figures retreat down the path. Something was changing. The intervention of one stranger had somehow shifted the social dynamics of the village, had given others permission to question the established order, to reach across the barrier that had isolated her for so long. She spent the afternoon in a daze, alternating between household tasks and simply sitting by her fire, holding the bread from the basket as if it were precious treasure. It was only bread, she told herself, simple food, no different from what she baked herself. But it represented so much more. Acceptance, possibility, the end of her exile from human connection. As evening approached, she heard the sound of a horse approaching. She looked out to see Halvard riding toward her farmstead on a sturdy brown mare. He raised a hand in greeting, and she found herself smiling, a genuine expression of pleasure that felt strange on her face after so long. "I hope I am not intruding," he called as he dismounted. "I wanted to see how you fared after last night." "You are not intruding at all," Ingrid assured him, coming out to meet him. "In fact, you have excellent timing. I was hoping to thank you properly, but I did not know where to find you." She told him about the morning's visitors, about the gift of bread and the invitation to join the women at the well. As she spoke, she saw satisfaction cross his features, as if this outcome had been exactly what he had hoped to achieve. "Good," he said when she finished. "That is very good. It seems your neighbors have more sense than I initially credited them with." "It is because of you," Ingrid said. "Your intervention last night changed something. It gave people permission to question the way things have been, to reach out when before they stayed silent." Halvard shook his head. "I merely said what needed to be said. If others were moved to act differently, that speaks to their own conscience, not my words. You give me too much credit." "I give you exactly the credit you are due," Ingrid countered with unexpected firmness. "You saw injustice, and you acted. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, a rare and valuable thing." They stood looking at each other, and something passed between them, an understanding or recognition that went beyond words. Halvard cleared his throat and gestured to the farmstead around them. "Would you show me your land? I confess I'm curious to see what you have built here." Ingrid felt a swell of pride as she led him around her property, showing him the well-maintained animal pens, the storage shed where she kept her tools and supplies, the small garden plot, now mostly harvested for the season, but still showing evidence of careful tending. Halvard asked questions that demonstrated genuine interest and knowledge of farming, and she found herself explaining her methods and plans with an enthusiasm she had not known she possessed. "You have done well," Halvard said when the tour was complete. "Very well indeed. This is a thriving farmstead, especially for one person managing it alone. You should be proud." "I am," Ingrid admitted. "It has been hard, but it is mine. I built this with my own hands, kept it going through harsh winters and difficult seasons. Whatever else may be said of me, no one can claim I have not worked for what I have." "No, they cannot," Halvard agreed. "And now I think fewer will be inclined to speak ill of you at all. You are becoming a person again in their eyes, not just a convenient target for their judgment." They walked back toward the longhouse, and Ingrid surprised herself by asking, "Would you stay for supper? It will be simple fare, but I would be honored to share my table with you." Halvard smiled. "I would be delighted." Inside, Ingrid busied herself preparing the meal while Halvard sat by the fire, the picture of comfortable companionship. She brought out vegetables from her storage, some of the salted meat from the morning's gift basket, and fresh bread. As she worked, they talked, the conversation flowing easily between them. "How long have you been a trader?" Ingrid asked as she stirred the stew pot hanging over the fire. 5 years, Halvard replied. "Before that, I was a farmer like my father. But when he died and my brother inherited the family land, I found myself at loose ends. Trading seemed like a way to make my own path, to see more of the world than the fields I had known all my life." "Do you enjoy it?" "The traveling?" Halvard considered the question. "Yes and no. I enjoy the freedom, the variety, the chance to meet different people and see new places. But there is a loneliness to it, as I mentioned last night. A traveling man has no community, no roots. He is always a stranger, always passing through. Sometimes I wonder if I have traded one kind of isolation for another." Ingrid nodded, understanding perfectly. "I know something of isolation, though mine has been forced rather than chosen." "Perhaps that is the difference," Halvard said. "Choice versus circumstance. But the result, the loneliness, is much the same, regardless of its source." They ate together as the fire crackled and the last light faded from the sky outside. The conversation drifted from topic to topic. Stories of Halvard's travels, tales of Ingrid's struggles to establish her farm, shared observations about human nature and the peculiarities of different communities. Ingrid could not remember the last time she had talked so much or so freely. "I leave tomorrow," Halvard said eventually, regret evident in his voice. "My route takes me north along the coast, and I must reach the next settlement before the worst of the winter weather makes travel dangerous." Ingrid felt disappointment settle in her chest. She had known his stay would be brief, but somehow she had not expected to feel its brevity so keenly. "I understand. You have your obligations, your livelihood. I am grateful for the time you have spent here." "Will you be all right?" Halvard asked, concern evident. "After I leave, I mean. Your situation seems to be improving, but Sina and her allies will not forget or forgive easily. They may try to make trouble for you." "I will manage," Ingrid said, with more confidence than she felt. "I always have, and now perhaps I will not be as alone in facing whatever comes. Your intervention has given me allies I did not have before. That is a gift beyond price." Halvard stood to leave, the lateness of the hour demanding his departure. At the door he paused. "I will return in the spring," he said. "My trading route brings me through this region twice yearly. When I come back, I hope to find you well and thriving." "I hope so too," Ingrid replied. "Safe travels, Halvard. May the gods watch over your journey." He mounted his horse and rode off into the darkness, leaving Ingrid standing in her doorway with emotions swirling in her heart that she could not quite name. She felt gratitude, certainly, and sadness at his leaving. But there was something else, too, something warmer and more complicated that she was not quite ready to examine too closely. The next morning, Ingrid made her way to the village well as promised. Her heart beat faster as she approached, nervousness making her steps hesitant. What if the invitation had been merely politeness? What if she was about to walk into another situation of exclusion and judgment? But when she arrived, Astrid waved her over with genuine warmth. "Ingrid, we are glad you came. Here, let me introduce you properly." She gestured to the other women gathered around the well, perhaps a dozen in all. Some Ingrid recognized from the feast, others were new faces. The women greeted her with varying degrees of friendliness, ranging from cautious but polite to warmly welcoming. Notably absent was Sina and her closest companions, and Ingrid suspected that the women's circle had fractured, with some choosing this new gathering over the old one. As the morning progressed and conversations flowed around the business of drawing water, Ingrid found herself gradually relaxing. Questions were asked about her farm, her sheep, her plans for winter. She answered honestly and found her answers received with interest rather than judgment. When she asked questions in return, she was included in discussions of village matters, her opinions solicited and valued. It was not perfect. Some women remained reserved, clearly unsure about this change in the social order. Others were friendly but cautious, testing the waters of this new dynamic. But it was progress, real and undeniable. For the first time since arriving in the village, Ingrid felt like she might actually belong somewhere. The days that followed brought more changes. Neighbors began to acknowledge her when she walked through the village. A farmer whose land adjoined hers stopped by to discuss sharing resources for spring planting. The blacksmith, who had always been coolly professional in their transactions, struck up actual conversation when she came to have a tool repaired. Small shifts, each one insignificant on its own, but together representing a fundamental change in her place within the community. But not everyone was pleased with these developments. Sina, humiliated at the feast and now finding her social power diminished, became increasingly hostile. She spread new rumors, tried to rally her remaining allies against Ingrid, spoke loudly about the impropriety of a lone woman entertaining a strange man at her farmstead. Some listened, but fewer than before. The tide had turned, and Sina found herself increasingly isolated in her vendetta. Winter settled over the land with cold winds and early snows. Ingrid prepared her farmstead, bringing her animals into shelter, checking her food stores, ensuring her longhouse was secure against the harsh weather to come. But this winter felt different from the previous two. She had friends now, or at least the beginnings of friendships. She had people who checked on her, who offered help when she needed it, who invited her to join them for small gatherings and shared work. And through the long, dark nights, as the wind howled around her home and snow piled high against her walls, Ingrid found herself thinking often of Halvard. She wondered where he was, if he was safe, if his travels went well. She remembered their conversations, the way he had looked at her with respect and genuine interest, the warmth of his presence in her small home. Spring felt very far away, and yet she found herself looking forward to it with an anticipation she had not felt in years. One particularly harsh evening, as she sat spinning wool by her fire, Ingrid reflected on how much her life had changed in the span of a single season. She was not fully integrated into the community, not entirely free from judgment or suspicion, but she was no longer invisible, she was no longer alone. She had proven to herself and others that she could not only survive but thrive, that her worth was not determined by others' approval, but by her own efforts and integrity. And perhaps most importantly, she had learned that change was possible, that a life could shift from one path to another, that isolation need not be permanent, that one person's courage could inspire others to examine their own choices and find them wanting. Halvard had been the catalyst, but the transformation was hers. She had chosen to accept the offered friendships, to open herself to possibility, to step out of the protective shell of silence and isolation she had built around herself. As the fire burned low and sleep beckoned, Ingrid allowed herself to imagine spring. She pictured the snow melting, the first green shoots appearing, the lengthening days bringing warmth back to the land, and she imagined a traveller on a brown mare riding up the path to her farmstead, grey eyes lighting with pleasure at seeing her again. She did not know what would come of that imagined meeting. She did not know if the connection she felt with Halvard was mutual or simply a product of her long loneliness, finding an outlet. But she knew that she would face whatever came with more strength than she had possessed before. She had rediscovered her own worth, had built alliances within her community, had proven to herself that she could not only survive, but flourish. The winter would be long and harsh, as all winters in these northern lands were, but Ingrid no longer feared it. She had weathered worse storms than any nature could provide. She had survived the cold winds of isolation and rejection, had found her way through the darkness of complete aloneness. She was strong enough for whatever came next. As she drifted towards sleep, wrapped in wool blankets with her fire banked for the night, Ingrid felt something she had not experienced in longer than she could remember. Contentment. Not happiness, perhaps. That was too strong a word for her still fragile new circumstances, but contentment, a sense of being at peace with where she was and who she was. a quiet confidence that tomorrow would be better than yesterday, that the future held possibilities she had not dared to imagine just a few short weeks ago. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the land in white silence. Inside, a woman who had been invisible finally allowed herself to be seen, to be valued, to be known. And in that simple act of accepting her own worth, she took the first step toward a future that would be entirely her own making. The journey was far from over. Challenges would come, setbacks were inevitable, and the path forward would not always be smooth. But Ingrid had discovered something more valuable than any treasure, the knowledge that she was not alone, that she was worthy of defense and respect, that her strength was real and her life had value. Armed with that knowledge, she could face whatever storms lay ahead. And when spring came, when the ice melted and the first flowers pushed through the thawing ground, she would be ready. Ready to continue building her life, ready to deepen the friendships she had begun to form, ready to see where the future might lead. And if that future included a traveling trader with grey eyes and a kind heart, well, she would face that possibility with the same courage she had learned to apply to everything else. For now, though, she rested. She had earned this peace, this quiet contentment. Tomorrow would bring its own demands and opportunities. Tonight, she could simply be a woman with a warm home, a thriving farm, and the first real hope she had known in longer than she could remember. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Epilogue. Spring arrived with the rushing sound of melting snow and the return of birdsong to the northern lands. Ingrid stood outside her longhouse, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face after the long winter, and marveled at how different the world looked now compared to when the snows had first come. The winter had been productive. She had grown closer to Astrid and Solveig, the three women forming a genuine friendship, born of shared work and honest conversation. Other villagers had gradually warmed to her, and while she would never be at the center of social circles, she was too private by nature, too marked by her years of isolation. She was no longer an outsider. She was simply Ingrid, a woman who managed her farm well and kept to herself, but could be relied upon for help when needed, and whose company was pleasant when she chose to offer it. Sina had eventually given up her campaign against Ingrid, finding herself increasingly isolated as others tired of her vindictiveness. The women's circles had reformed around new centers of influence, and Sina's power had diminished to nothing. She now kept mostly to herself, perhaps learning her own lessons about the consequences of cruelty. But on this particular spring morning, Ingrid was not thinking about Sina or village politics. She was thinking about a trader who had promised to return when winter gave way to warmer seasons. She did not know if he would keep that promise. Men often said things in parting they did not truly mean, but she found herself hoping nonetheless. She was in her garden, turning soil in preparation for planting, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the path. Her heart jumped, and she straightened, shading her eyes against the sun. The figure approaching was unmistakable, a tall man on a brown mare, sitting his horse with easy confidence. Halvard pulled up at the edge of her property and dismounted with a smile. "Well met, Ingrid. I hope I find you in good health and spirits." "You do," she replied, unable to keep the joy from her voice. "Very good indeed. Welcome back, Halvard. I had hoped you would return." "Did you doubt it?" he asked, walking toward her. Halvard smiled warmly, the sunlight catching the grey in his eyes. "Never," he said simply. "I meant every word. There are few places where a man is welcomed as he was here, and fewer still where the people are as strong and resilient as yourself." Ingrid felt a swell of emotion she could not name. Gratitude, hope, something new and fragile. "Come, then," she said, stepping aside to let him enter her garden. "There is much to prepare for the growing season." Together they walked among the budding plants and turned soil rich with promise. The past was behind them, the loneliness, the judgment, the isolation. Ahead lay work, friendship, and perhaps something more, a future shaped by courage and kindness rather than fear and scorn. And as spring awakened the land, it also awakened something within Ingrid, a hope that no longer needed to be hidden, a strength ready to grow, and the quiet certainty that she would never face the world alone again. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like, subscribe, and comment to share where you're watching from. There are many more tales from the Viking Age coming soon. Until next time, stay strong and brave like those who walked the longhouses before us.